Hey everyone, welcome back to the Carrot Poker School. Welcome to Grade 1, Lecture 6. Today's primary topic is going to be range and nut advantage, but we're going to use these really common poker concepts to figure out how to construct a succinct, clear, and effective c-bet strategy on the flop. It's a very common situation to find yourself in. You raise pre-flop, you pick up a call, usually from the big blind, but not always. And you have to figure out, always in this situation, there's really never a time when you don't have to solve the conundrum of what hands to c-bet on the flop for what sizing. So there are two elements to c-bet strategy, frequency and sizing. That's the global frequency, the overall frequency with which your range will bet, and the sizing it will choose if your hand decides to bet. What we need to be clear on is that we don't need to play 4 or 5 sizes on the flop. We can play 1, but we may have a bigger bet on some textures and a smaller bet on others. Today we're going to learn how to estimate the frequency your range should bet at, how to select hands to bet, what size to bet them, through the lens of understanding the core concepts of range and nut advantage. As this is an academic, thorough school of poker, we're going to start with a clear definition. So having a significantly large range advantage can be achieved with a combination of the following range versus range attributes. But before I lay these out, before I show you what aspects of ranges will commonly contribute to having a range advantage or disadvantage, I want to say a few words on what range thinking really means, because this is a bit of a confusing subject. So when we start thinking in terms of range versus range, we don't replace hand thinking with range thinking. We don't start ignoring what we have, and we certainly do not start sabotaging the EV of our hand in order to maximize the EV of our range. This is not a thing. In GTO, there are no so-called loss leaders. That's to say there are no hands that hurt their own EV in order to cause your opponent to play in some sort of way. Actually, the goal in poker theory is to maximize the EV of your range by maximizing the EV of every hand, but doing so in a cohesive way where you're not opening yourself up to counter exploitation. So it's kind of like balancing on a knife edge, trying to play every hand in the best way you possibly can, but when you're indifferent between betting and checking on the flop, for example, which you often will be, making sure that you mix both actions in the long term in order to not open yourself up to counter exploitation. That's what you see solvers do when you see them build a strategy on the flop. What we mustn't fall into the trap of doing is saying something like, well, if I had a bluff, I would do X, so with my value hand, I'm also going to do X. This is too far down the balance route. Your value hands are actually the drivers of your line. They're like driving the bus, so to speak. The bluffs are more the passengers. So as we saw in Lecture 2, your value hands are still going to choose your sizing. They're going to define how much money goes into the pot by the end of the hand. The bluffs are going to play along. What we don't want to do is get lost down the rabbit hole of meta thinking. He thinks, I think, I'm going to represent, I'm going to pretend that I have. If I had X, I would do Y. These kind of thoughts are not particularly useful, and they detract from the point that we're trying to maximize the EV of our hand against our opponent's strategy, which is defined by the way we're playing our strategy. So in a kind of circular way, the best thing for our hand to do is dependent on our own range through the medium of our opponent's strategy. Our opponent's play in game theory is dependent on our range, and our hand's EV is dependent on our opponent's play. Therefore, in an indirect sense, our hand's EV is dependent on our own range, but not directly, right? You don't get some magic reward from the poker heavens by choosing exactly the right frequency of betting a gut shot on the flop. It doesn't happen. Solvers have infinite time to battle each other and perfect information to use about each other's strategies, and that's why you see them really care about exact frequencies. We're not going to care about exact frequencies or balance down to the microscopic view like that, but what we are going to do is think about how the overall range versus range situation impacts the play, the relative hand strength of different hands, the bet frequencies, the sizes, that sort of thing. So I hope that's clear. It's not an either or thing where we just suddenly switch from hand thinking to range thinking. One fits into the other. How do we determine when we have a large range advantage? The first thing, and perhaps something that's maybe too obvious or dangerously obvious, is thinking about the nuts. Thinking about having more very high equity hands as a concentration of your range than your opponent does of his or hers. Why is this maybe a dangerous thing? Because it's not the full story. The nuts are very hard to have. You don't get paid out for having queen high in a video poker machine because queen high is a bad hand that's really easy to have. So the hardest hands to have are also the rarest, but they're kind of the most strikingly obvious as well. But what the brain is doing is over-prioritizing them because they're so striking, they're so impactful, scary when they're in their opponent's range, exciting when you have them. We all love flopping a set, right? But how often do you flop a set? How often do you make a straight? You know, these are not big parts of ranges, so while we should accept that they do have an impactful role because they're so strong when they do come around, And sometimes the board allows them to come around a lot. Like if you have a queen on a board of ace, king, jack, 10, 5 rainbow, you have the nuts, but it's really common to have just a single queen. But, I digress. The point is that these hands do have a large effect on range advantage, but they're far from the full story. Range advantage is about entire range against entire range, not just the most obviously strong hands. Having more quite high equity hands is actually a very major and common way in which range advantage gets boosted. For example, a cutoff opener on a king high board will have more combos of king queen as a percentage of his or her range than the opponent will, because the opponent would 3-bet some king queen and would be diluted by more lower cards as well. So quite high equity hands, things like top pair, decent kicker, top pair, good kicker, maybe even top pair, weak kicker, second pair, good kicker, open end straight draws, flush draws, combo draws, trips on a board that's not that great, a set on a monotone board, something like this, you get the point. These are more abundant than the very high equity hands, they're easier to have, and in a way they're actually more impactful sometimes to range advantage, not because they're as powerful, but because they're more abundant. And then thirdly, and the most neglected way in which range advantage is actually affected by range composition, is how many very low equity hands you have as a concentration of your range. Why is Big Blind suffering so much on ace, ace, 7 rainbow against a hijack opener? It's not actually because hijack has way more ace-x. Hijack does have way more ace-x as a concentration, but Big Blind has a hell of a lot of ace-x too. The problem is that the ace-x in Big Blind's range on ace, ace, 7 is heavily diluted by lots of combos of low cards and offsuit broadways that just had to call a small open. The bigger the open gets, the less this is a problem for Big Blind, but against a min open, for example, which is really commonplace and popular these days because solvers endorse it heavily in higher rake situations, the min open is just kind of king these days, and against min opens you're going to be flatting so many very low equity hands on a lot of textures that are going to dilute your range in the Big Blind and make your range a lot weaker. So you have to be aware that when you're assessing who's doing better on a certain flop texture configuration, it's not just about these obvious hands that you can list, it's about all parts of ranges. So thinking about entire range against entire range can be really confusing, and you can get overwhelmed, your mind can get cluttered very easily. A student emailed me last night, a prospective student, haven't started working with this chap yet, but he said, my mind is getting completely lost and overwhelmed at the tables. I've studied more poker, I paraphrase here, in the last few months than I have in my life. I've looked at solvers, I've watched video courses, I've done all of this stuff, and I've never had less confidence in my game. My game has never been weaker than what it is right now. And that's because he was overloaded with half-learned ideas, and hopefully we'll start working together and I can help him fix this stuff. But this is a really common thing, so when you stop thinking just about, oh, I have a flush draw, I like betting my flush draw, I have a pair, I want to bet for value, I have this hand I'll call because he might be bluffing, when you move from that very basic level and start thinking more about range versus range interactions, and you do that too soon and you do it to big of an extent, you can actually get more lost than you were before. You can kind of end up not being able to see the forest through the trees, so to speak. So before we install the right thought processes, and this is an absolute staple of my private coaching, let's uninstall the wrong ones. When I first meet a student, I tend to do video reviews these days. I've bounced around between all different kinds of initial sessions in one-to-one coaching, and I've landed on the idea that I want to start by hearing them think. I want to see them talking through a video of their own play and actually trying to replicate what they were thinking in game. Because what I need to do before I start installing a bunch of software, if you imagine their mind is like a broken hard drive, I need to take all of the cluttered, unhelpful, half-baked, half-learned ideas and actually just wrong things that have been instantiated in that person's neural network of poker decision-making and rip them out before I've got the space to put something else in there. So what we want to do today, as we explore these two extremely helpful but also potentially toxic concepts that, if taken too far, if misunderstood, can butcher your thought process even worse, is we want to take this confused, unhappy brain that's got way too many tangled thoughts that don't cohere well with one another and turn it into something a bit less cluttered and more organized. And yeah, I'd say that this is one of the lectures in grade 1 that you probably want to watch multiple times and or go very slowly, just plod your way through it, pausing, thinking, making sure you're not misapplying stuff. Don't jump into a session after this lecture and just go, I have a range advantage, I bet, for every single spot you're in. This is the misappropriation of the material that I see people use the most. And remember, I've taught this school a lot of times before I recorded the professional video format that you're watching right now. And I was always very careful during this lecture that the students didn't get carried away, because it's so tempting when you learn a new concept to just abuse it and use it and butcher it and just take it too far, right? So let's start with some fallacies. In order to uninstall bad, dangerous traps, we need to know what they are, and then we'll start plugging in the right thought processes for range advantage, nut advantage, c-bet frequency, and sizing. We will get to a very succinct strategy at the end of this lecture, but we're going to get there carefully and in the right way, methodically. So the nut obsession fallacy, first and foremost, is that you'll sometimes hear poker players claim to have a range advantage and then proceed to just list nutted hands. This is so bad. I see this all the time, and it's really dangerous for you guys watching this, grade 1 level students who are naively perhaps and curiously opening up some training video on some site or some YouTube video or Twitch stream or whatever it may be. Someone who purports to be a strong poker player / coach is then saying, I have a range advantage here because I have more ace king and ace queen on this board, or I have a range advantage here because I have top set. And he doesn't. This is ridiculous. A range can be like 200, 400, 600 combos opening from under the gun, cut off, small blind, respectively. It can be a lot of combos. Focusing on only the best ones can never be the way to go. Range advantage is about range equity. Range equity is about the accumulation of all of the hands in your range, adding up their equity and dividing them by the sum of all of those hands to see what the mean equity is and comparing it to that of your opponent. So while a set is great when you have it and it has like 100% equity, maybe, probably not that much, it's not the full story. So you can't just think that a hand that's diluted by 500 other hands could have that big an effect. So just as having a lot of medium equity hands in your range will move your equity towards the middle, lots of bad hands will move your equity down, quite good hands will shift your equity up considerably, and very good hands will shift it up more per hand, but there aren't that many of them. That's the thing with the nutted hand. Remember the video poker machine. It's not going to give you quads very often, or it would go broke. The machine would go broke. It would have to find a new job, working at McDonald's or something. So the whole range versus range picture is what is important for determining range advantage. The full thing. I think I've beaten this dead horse enough, but this is the kind of quote you'll hear. Whenever I put so before a quote, you know it's a bad poker player that's saying that. Not that all bad poker players say so I mean, you shouldn't really start a sentence with so. I do it a lot in speech. I try not to in slides when I'm making PowerPoints. But this is like my code for don't listen to this person. So we have a lot more combos of sets here, so we have a range advantage. No. You might have a nut advantage because of that, and we're going to get to that later on today. But you don't necessarily have a range advantage because you have a lot more combos of sets. Sets are just the very fringe, the very top of the range. For example, imagine we're playing a game where the highest score wins, and you can choose a range of numbers, and I'm left with the other range of numbers. Which range of numbers would you choose? These are equal weighting, so you have one combo of -20 in the left-hand range, one combo of +10, one of +8, one of +12, same for the right-hand range. Well, if you've done the math, you will know that the right-hand range is worth more, because it adds up to 15, whereas the left-hand range adds up to 10. I mean, you want 15, right? 15 beats 10. But if you just look at nut advantage, if you just look at the nutted combos, the equivalent in numerical form, the +12 and +10 are the nuts, and the left-hand range has them, and the right-hand range does not. So this person who says, so we have more combos of 10 and 12 here, so we have a range advantage, has completely ignored how bad it is to have -20 in your range. In other words, poker equivalent, this range has tons of combos of trash in it, basically, and that's making it weaker overall. Imagine your pre-flop and your range contains a combo of aces and all of the combos of all the low cards at the bottom left of the hand grid, right, where all the offsuit stuff reside. What happens if you just raise all of them because you could have aces? Well, your opponent knows that you almost never have aces if they know what your range is, and they just assume that you have nothing. So, of course, you have to be worried about over-aggressing in spots where you land in a situation with way too much air. If you land on the river with a ton of air in your range and a few combos of the nuts, you need to give up most of your air in game theory in order to not be over-bluffing like a lunatic. Another fallacy that bites people in these situations is the total amount fallacy. Here we have an abacus. Cool little contraption, bit obsolete these days, but the total amount fallacy occurs when we ignore how concentrated good hands are and just talk about how many absolute combos of them we have. This is a really key point. So here's a question. Would you rather your range contained 2 combos of ace-ace or 1 combo of ace-ace? Well, it would depend on the rest of the range, wouldn't it? But all else being equal, you'd want 2 combos of aces, you'd want the nuts more often, but all else isn't always equal in poker. For example, which range is stronger? Take your time, think about it. I'll assume you have an answer. Range B is stronger, because range B has higher equity. Aces is a very high equity hand, 7-3 is a very low equity starting hand. When you have the good one 50% of the time, you have like an average strength range, right? An amazing hand and then a terrible hand. I mean, this range is actually really great because aces is just amazingly good, but you get the point. Range A is also a range I would love to have pre-flop. If you said to me, Pete, you can get aces one time in 3 and 7-3 offsuit, the rest, I'd be like, yeah, give me the 4 combos of 7-3, I'll take the aces 1/3 of the time. Imagine getting dealt aces 1/3 of the time. That's amazing. But it's not as good as getting aces half the time. Range B is stronger than range A. But range A contains more combos of aces. So if you answer the first question with, give me the range with more combos of aces, you have the wrong choice here. So yeah, all else being equal, you want 2 combos of aces, but you need to see the full range to know. We don't care about how many combos of good hands we have, that's not what's important. We care about how concentrated those combos are. What matters to my range advantage is how often I have a good hand compared with how often I have a bad hand in relation to how often you have good and bad hands. What matters to my nut advantage is how often I have the nuts compared with how often I don't have the nuts, not how many combos of the nuts I have overall. Higher concentration of aces in range B. Aces is the best hand ever. Having it half the time is better than having it 1/3 of the time. On to one of the least eloquently named slides ever, the range advantage therefore bet fallacy, and the range disadvantage therefore check fallacy. I left this one as it was though, because I quite like how clumsy it is. So as we'll see, having a large range advantage makes our range want to bet more often on the flop, and having a large range disadvantage means we'll usually check, especially when out of position on the flop. But generally speaking on the turn and river, we should polarize more. We don't really want to bet medium strength hands. There's less denial to gain, there's less thin value to gain generally. Fold equity is less useful. On the flop, it's a bit weird, right? You can often bet absolutely everything because your range is never that. You never have that many completely mediocre hands on the flop because your opponent is always able to sort of outdraw you, or you can outdraw him or whatever. You never have hands that have no purpose at all in betting on the flop, usually. So you can, when things are going your way range-wise, you can bet everything. But we'll come to that a bit later. We'll talk about how range advantage increases bet frequency and why. Here's a spot. Cutoff has pocket eights and checks back against big blind as a pre-flop raiser. Big blind checks the turn and cutoff bets on the queen with pocket eights. The reason that cutoff bet here is that cutoff said, so we have a large range advantage in this spot. The queen is much better for us than it is for him, so we're going to go ahead and bet. We're going to represent ace king, we're going to represent king 9, we're going to represent queen 10. The problem is that all of that may be true, and indeed cutoff's range here does have 57.5% equity, zero-sum game, heads up pot. Big blind has 42.5% equity, and the logic in this spot is that you don't want to be betting with the middle of your range. You don't want to be betting with a hand that gets called by pretty much everything that beats it, gets folds from everything that it's doing well against. Like what you're doing well against with a 6-5. Your opponent folds ace deuce, you know, whoop-de-doo. Who cares? He folds a tiny bit of equity, it doesn't really matter. So the point here is that having a range advantage that's large, 57% is massive, right? That's like a big range advantage. For a hand, that wouldn't be a good hand, but for an entire range to be 57 against 43, that's a lot, right? Because it's averaged out over so many different random hands. So that's actually a big range advantage. And delayed c-bet spots are very favorable worlds for the delayed c-better, especially on this card. Ace king is a huge thing here, but that nut advantage, that range advantage, cutoff has kind of both of these here with the queen turn. Definitely a range advantage anyway. Nut advantage is less clear after he checks back flop, but then yeah, the queen does reinstate some nutted combos like ace king. But the point is, like, you don't bet the middle of your range on the turn just because your overall range is doing well. It doesn't follow. It's never a sufficient reason to bet your hand that your range is doing well, so I don't want any of you to go away after this class and go, range advantage, therefore bet. That's a huge fallacy. You still have to be constructing a sensible, polarized betting range with value bets and bluffs, as we've been guiding you how to do in the Carrot Poker School Grade 1 so far. Despite having a big range advantage, we cannot bet this middling hand. This sort of error, it might seem obvious to you. You might be thinking, this is clearly a check. Like, come on, Pete, move on. But polarization errors are extremely prevalent among students of your level. If you're watching this grade 1 class and you're thinking, this is about the right level for me to start at, then you probably make a bunch of polarization errors without realizing. That means that you overinvest aggressively with an aggressive action, either a raise or call, with certain hands that are too mediocre to bluff and too mediocre to value bet, like this. 4s is the nuts here, pretty much. Flop goes check, bet, call. Who's the 10 good for? Ignore cutoff's hand. I know you're staring at like the biggest nuttedest hand ever. Ignore that. Who is the 10 good for? That's right, it's great for big blind. This is the turn that we actually referred to in a past lecture as a disaster paradigm turn for cutoff. This pattern of the second card pairing is massively better for the player that took the passive action on the flop, the call, who's strongly condensed towards having second pair, Not good for the person that just B75 the flop and polarized away from having a mediocre hand. So this is a dreadful spot for Cutoff's range, but Cutoff has to play his hand as well. Cutoff can't just evaluate this spot based on how well his range is doing, because that would be to turn a blind eye to your hand strength, which would basically be to play poker like a blind person. I had a friend in university once claim that her dad was really good at poker, so good in fact that he never looked at his cards. Even then I knew that was nonsense. If you're watching this video, your dad was never good at poker. Sorry. So this is a blunder to check this hand. Just because your range wants to check a lot doesn't mean that you don't still have a betting range. And if there's one hand here in the world that you have to bet, it's pocket fours, because you unblock a jack, you unblock a 10, and the urgency is high because that's right guys, you guessed it, you're in position. If you check, you go straight to the river. Out of position, no problem. Out of position, check your whole range, I don't care. Out of position, you don't need to bet anything because your opponent's going to be betting pretty often here, reopening. If they have a 10, they bet, you check raise, you jam river, you stack a 10, happy days. In this spot, if they have a 10, you check back. Not good. You're now in the river, there's one street left. They bet, you raise, they call. Maybe they check, you bet, they call on a bad river. Maybe they check, you bet, they raise, you jam, they fold. I don't know. There's lots of ways you don't win a stack there, for sure. So, the urgency of fours is high. You gotta bet. It doesn't matter that your range isn't doing well. Despite that, you have to bet this particular hand, and therefore you have to have some bluffs as well. It's fine if your bet frequency is like 18% of the time globally for your range. When I say globally, I mean the average for your range on this turn. As long as you bet fours. As long as fours is always betting, like that's okay. You can build a very, very scarce betting range that just usually you check. But you have to bet this hand. So again, hand thinking and range thinking are not alternatives, they're interlinked. Let me show you in both of these situations how hand thinking and range thinking come together. In situation 1, we can say that we have a big range advantage, therefore we will have a lot of natural fold equity in this spot, and we'll want to bluff often, and we'll have a lot of natural value bets as well. Villain will be folding really often, so the EV of our bluffs will be super high, and some of them will be like mandatory bluffs immediately, because the fold equity will be so high. Eights doesn't use the fold equity well, so eights is immune to this argument, and eights is still higher EV as a check as per the rule of polarization. When you have a medium strength hand on the turn, you check. So it doesn't matter that our opponent is reacting to our range being strong by folding a lot, because this hand doesn't use the fold equity that comes from him folding ace-x and low pocket pairs and low suited connectors. In hand 2, your range is doing terribly, but that's actually really good for fours. The thing is here that when your range is doing badly, it means that your opponent's range is doing well, and your opponent will be making a lot of investments and will have trips a lot and stuff like that. And if you bomb this turn and then overbet jam the river, they may not realize that some trips should be folded now, and that's really good for you, right? So the fact that your range is doing badly compared to your opponent's range, which is doing well, is actually good for you when you have 2 fours, and betting is good here. Out of position, you can check raise. Different story. Let's move on. So nut advantage. Having a significantly large nut advantage. Completely separate thing from range advantage. These are not the same thing. Do not confuse them. Nut advantage can be achieved by having very high equity hands. Let's not say the absolute nuts, not literally, but very high equity hands, let's say around 85% plus, though this will depend on how wet the board is, because on flush draw boards, for example, or straight draw boards, or both, a lot of the equity that you lack, that your opponent has, will come from having a worse hand than you, whereas on a dry board, if a set only has 85%, it's because your opponent has like bigger sets or something, right? So equity is much better than it looks on a wetter board, because the hands it's losing to are very few and far between, and the only reason you don't have like 95% equity is that your opponent has some draws that you can still bet against. So you can bet with less equity on a wetter board than you would need to have on a drier board. That's the rule for every sizing. Again, fallacies, my favorite thing is pointing out all the ways where you guys go wrong. I could sit here and just teach you what to do, but I'd rather make you feel bad instead. No, that's not really it. But I do want to uninstall bad things in your poker thought process before we install all the good stuff. And there are 2 fallacies here that we may fall victim to when trying to determine if we have a meaningful nut advantage. Firstly, the literal nuts fallacy. I've heard people say this, but we have more 9-6. I stream a lot on Twitch, and you'll hear people in the chat say, you've got more of the straight than him, you should just bet. It'll be like a completely ridiculous argument where they're adding 2 and 2 together and getting 15. 9-6 suited is 4 combos. If you have more of that than someone, if you have 9-6 suited in your range and that hand is a straight, you are necessarily in one of these late range configurations, like late position battles, right? There's no way you're like under the gun there, unless you're playing like a maniac. So you're in the small blind or the button, and you're against a big blind caller or something. Ranges are 500 or 600 combos wide. So these 4 combos just cannot possibly have that much of an effect. Nutsophobia is basically the human brain's tendency to, it comes from natural selection, right? But the tendency to just pick out the most scary thing and play against that. I'm not sure how well this picture of a guy playing VR with a ghost haunting him is depicting this, but I think it's just, you see a set is possible, you see a flush is possible, you imagine your opponent has a certain hand, and then without even necessarily thinking about how abundant combinatorically that hand is, you may just like picture it, play against it, put the blinkers on, and just only look at the branch of the tree where your worst fears come true. This is an epidemic because humans are wired to fear the thing that's the most harmful. If there were lots of different factors in play today, but one of them was that your town was being bombed heavily, you wouldn't want to leave the house, right? Even though there'd be other factors in play, your brain would go straight to that most scary and most threatening thing to your life. And so it should. But in poker it can be seeing ghosts because it's okay to sort of die at the game of poker by being stacked, right? It's like dying in a video game. It's totally fine to get stacked sometimes. As long as you're not getting stacked like every hand you play. You win a stack, you lose a stack. It's the way it goes. You play a session, you're probably going to stack someone, you're probably going to get stacked. Just fearing getting stacked and trying to avoid it, which is impossible, is a huge fallacy. And when we're thinking about nut advantage, we're not trying to obsess about our opponents having the nuts or only care about the literal nuts. We're just trying to develop a feel for who has a higher nut prevalence in their range and what that means. We'll get onto what that means shortly. So don't take the nuts too literally. It's more powerful to have 24 combos of 90% equity hands and 3 combos of 96% equity hands. Much better to have loads of something really good rather than a few things of something that's invincible. And just because villain has more nuts than you, or has the nuts a relevant amount of the time, doesn't mean you can't still bet hands for the purposes we've already discussed in this course. Don't fear the worst. Don't like check top pair on a turn when a flush gets there. Well, you could, that's fine, usually. But don't always check a value bettable top pair just because a flush got there. You should be playing in a more balanced way than that, where you still make some thinner value bets. Don't fear the worst. It's easy to fear the worst, it's instinctive, but resist that instinct. So how do we recognise our range advantage in practice then? On this flop, cutoff versus big blind, it's the in-position player who has the sizable range advantage, the out-of-position player has a sizable disadvantage, and Pi02 tells us that the range of cutoff here is boasting 55.226% equity, in theory. So where does this range advantage come from? 55 is quite a good amount of equity to have across an entire range, because again, that's diluted by having loads of bad hands, medium strength hands, pocket threes here, etc. But it comes from 3 main sources. Firstly, cutoff has unique hands, that's to say ones that the opponent doesn't have, or maybe unique hand could just mean sometimes a bit of a weaker definition, that we have them way more often than our opponent has them, or our opponent barely has them and we have them a lot. But anyway, these unique hands like overpairs here, jacks, tens, kings, etc. are very high equity. 80% is very high equity on this board because it's a wet board, and some of the reason your opponent has even as much as 20% equity on average against your kings is just that they have draws, right? Not hands that you can't value bet against, not hands that are actually beating you, just hands that are sometimes going to beat you, which is not the end of the world. And because 80% on a wet board is actually quite a lot of equity, I'm okay actually deeming this a nut advantage hand. And you're like, Pete, but it's not the nuts. I know, it's not the literal nuts, but we don't care about that. That's too small a region of the range to care about. We do care about it, but we don't stop there. So having lots of pocket kings, cutoff versus big blind on Jack 10-4, that's not monotone, does contribute towards your nut advantage heavily. It's a very high equity hand. So the nut advantage boost that this hand gives your range is part, as we saw, of your range advantage, but it's not identical to your range advantage. Cutoff has, secondly, more combinations as a percentage of his range. Remember, think about not absolute quantities, but percentages, dilution, concentration of top pair and second pair. You might look at that and think, well, top pair and second pair, they're not that good. Queen Jack only has 73% equity against big blind's range here, but these hands are still quite high equity, and if you imagine that the average hand here has like 55% equity in cutoff's range, having 73% is really, really good compared to 55. It's way above average. So a hand that has way above average equity does contribute towards range advantage, as does kings, but kings contributes towards both range advantage and nut advantage. Queen Jack contributes towards range advantage, not really nut advantage. The difference between kings and Queen Jack is about investment ceiling. A quite high equity hand such as Queen Jack doesn't crave such a big investment ceiling because by the time it's thrown tons and tons of bets into the middle and made the pot gigantic, it's no longer happy, but kings is still happy because kings unblocks a jack and beats every jack, and Queen Jack doesn't do either of those things. Thirdly, cutoff has less combinations as a percentage. Remember, cutoff does still have a lot of garbage here. Poker is a game in which you always have garbage. Ace deuce of spades is just there. You can't do anything about that. Ace 6 of diamonds, it's in your range. King 7 of diamonds, it's in your range. Too bad. But you know what? Big blind has way more of this more frequently. Why? 1, Big blind has unique hands like 7-5 of diamonds that you don't have. Basically small, suited, junky cards that were able to call for good pot odds. They were kind of live. In a sense, it's like the asymmetry of the pre-flop battle here that makes these hands callable, because you're avoiding opening like King 7 off here and King 5 off. The 7 and the 5 are quite live and able to actually peel with flush and straight draw potential, as well as some live pair and live trips potential and stuff like that. So this hand is a call for big blind pre. The other reason that you have way less low equity hands than your opponent is that while both players have 6-5 of spades here or ace-3 of spades, yours are diluted by big hands more than his are. So the big blind has probably exactly the same number of hands like 9-7 of spades than you do, like a fairly bad hand here. Okay, let's say 9-6 of spades, let's make it even worse. Let's say both players have the same number of... Do you open 9-6 from the cutoff? Maybe not. Let's go for something like the King 7 of diamonds, right? Let's say you both have the same number of those. The problem for big blind is that big blind's King 7 of diamonds are more prevalent because big blind's range is less combos than your range for opening. And that's because big blind would have folded or 3-bet with a lot more of the combos than... Not that he would have called with, but the calling range is only a couple of hundred combos here, but cutoff's opening 300 or 400 combos. So your range is wider, has more good stuff in it. The bad stuff that you have is more diluted, it's less concentrate. Opposite for big blind. All three of these reasons add up to explain why cutoff's range advantage is fairly severe in this spot. How do you recognize nut advantage now? A large nut advantage exists when, as a concentration of our range again, we have a lot more very high equity hands. Not necessarily literally nutted, but very high equity hands. And remember that these do not have to be the absolute literal nuts, as we saw. So in this next situation, it's the in-position player who has a large nut advantage, the preflop raiser, despite having less combos of the literal nuts. So big blind against under the gun, check by big blind, under the gun, single raise pot. It's going to use some big bets here, probably, we'll come to that. But basically under the gun cannot have threes or deuces, because in modern game theory, solvers have said, no, you can't open those hands. They're slightly losing to open from under the gun. Guess what though, guys? If you have like a bad player in the big blind and everything else is equal, you probably should just open those hands. But people don't. Usually, because their charts tell them not to, and people follow charts, they're good at that, right? So both players can have nines here at full frequency. I don't think big blind is ever really incentivized to 3-bet nines in this spot, but sets are an irrelevant part of ranges. So big blind's range here spans 202 combos according to my pre-flop sim, and deuces and threes are only 6 of them. That's 3% of the 202 combos, so big blind has flopped a set of threes or deuces 3% of the time, 6 combos of the time. Meanwhile, under the gun's range spans 224 combos, so it's wider. Not weaker, but wider, right? More combos. It's stronger and wider. That's not a contradiction. And under the gun's range contains jacks through aces, which are hands that under the gun has way more often than big blind, right? I.e. like a lot, and big blind just doesn't, ever. And these are 24 combos. That's 4 times the abundance of threes and deuces. These are 11% of under the gun's range. 11 is almost 4 times bigger than 3. That means that when we isolate the band of 85% equity plus hands here, meaning overpair plus, we see 4 times as many of that region in under the gun's range than big blinds. When we go up to the very top of ranges and we only think about sets, we're now looking at an irrelevant part of ranges, size-wise, but then it's big blind that has the advantage because he has 9 combos of sets instead of 3. Is 3 sets instead of 1. So we can look at Pio's Range Explorer to explore whether one player has a large nut advantage, or whatever solver you use. It doesn't have to be Pio, but if it's a good bit of software, it should have something like this, a Range Explorer graph tool. And here what we're looking at is the equity of the in-position range in red, the out-of-position range on this flop in green. And what we see is that the in-position range is ahead for the most part. Then when it comes to hitting pairs on the board around here, out of position actually has more combos in this region that are slightly better, hitting more like 3x, 9x. But then there's a spike here where the out of position player's range levels off at basically having a good 9, somewhere around here, but in position spikes up into the overpair region, and you can see the equity is much higher in this percentile of in position's range than it is in this percentile of out of position's range. And then at the very top, it's out of position who actually has the set advantage because he has way more. If we were to actually cut the graph off here and go range advantage is with big blind, we're talking about this much of the picture. How absurd is this? You see people say big blind has a range advantage because they have deuces and threes more. They've just ignored 95% of the graph. That's so stupid, but it happens. Not only the set's not even entail that you have a nut advantage because they're too small to even contribute that much towards nut advantage. Range advantage is a whole other story. But today what I want you guys to see is that by and large, that when we reach the 80% equity point, which is about our cutoff point for a nut advantage to qualify, for hand to qualify as a nut advantage major contributor on a two-tone flush draw board, then it's definitely in position that wields that in a massive way. And that, as we'll see shortly, is why in position is going to use larger c-bet sizing on this flop. Let's go back to range advantage to begin with though. We're now going to get to the point in the lecture where we can talk about what these things actually do to our strategy. Again, for now, just remaining within the context of c-betting flop. So whenever we have a large range advantage on the flop, we want to start betting more of our range. That means betting more frequently, not necessarily betting bigger. We're not talking about investment ceiling here, meaning the eventual amount of money we'll want to invest with our range. We're talking about how often we want to invest something immediately. This means we'll be betting a less polar range in spots where our range has a lot more equity than villains does, because we're betting more frequently. So we bet less polar. When we're betting infrequently, we bet polarized. And when we're betting less frequently, we merge the range out and start betting everything at the extreme. But why is this? Well, it all goes back to the three purposes of betting. A lot of poker courses, coaches, poker annotators will just tell you, your range is doing well here, so you should bet a lot. And they might not know why, or they might not tell you why if they do know why, but here is why. All three of your reasons for betting become more abundant and more lucrative when you have a range advantage. Therefore, you want to bet more hands because more hands will qualify as value bets, bluffing bets, denial bets, or a combination of two or three of these. On the flop, you can actually have a mixed bag of reasons, but more about that in grade 2. Bluffing and denial both benefit a lot from villain's range being weaker because villain will have to fold more frequently when he lacks the strength to continue the expected mathematical amount of the time. That MDF, minimum defense frequency, or pot odds norm fold equity, whatever you want to call it, that we've looked at, that assumes equality in EV. It assumes that neither range has an EV advantage, and a big part of an EV advantage, aka favorability, is range equity, aka range advantage. So just to clarify that, when I talk about range advantage, I mainly talk about range equity against range equity, right? Not so much EV, but it's a big part of EV. So basically, bluffing and denial will become higher EV in spots where your range has a big advantage because fold equity goes up. Bluffing loves that because when you're bluffing, the more fold equity you get, the better an idea it is to bluff compared with to not bluff. And denial bets love that, although they're not a thing on their own, right? They need to have a primary purpose, denial secondary. But a denial bet also likes more fold equity because it means that we run into the hand that punish it less often. Denial betting is like risk and reward. If you knew your opponent had a worse hand than you and was never going to bluff you later, you would always bet for denial because there'd be zero risk and 100% reward. You get the full pot. But when you start introducing hands that beat you, bluff raise you, make you fold, all of these things into your opponent's strategy, denial gets worse because of the downside. When your opponent's range is really, really weak, the risk side is low and the reward is therefore relatively high. Denial is a case of expenditure and profit. It's not just what you're getting, it's also what you're risking. It's not just what you're risking, it's also what you're getting. Let's look at these in turn. So when it comes to value betting, you will do more value betting when you have a range advantage because you will have more hands that are strong enough against your opponent's range to have a high enough equity, starting equity, that they satisfy the criteria for being able to make a value bet investment of a certain size. So you'll just do it more often, right? You'll have more hands that qualify, more hands that are highly plus EV to bet. You'll also want to value bet more thinly and value bet immediately because in a spot where your range is doing well, you can't rely on your opponent's range to do a lot of investing. If your range was much, much weaker than mine, I couldn't, and you knew that, and I knew that you knew that, it wouldn't be reasonable for me to slow play and trap you and try and get you to bet because you'd be incentivized to just check, try and realize equity and get to showdown. You wouldn't want to bluff very often. Maybe you can bluff sometimes, but generally speaking, you'd have a lot of bad hands that just want to scrape their way to a bit of showdown or just basically give up because you'd be over bluffing if you bluffed them all. So when you have a big range advantage, it means that you need to fast play more of your good hands because you can't rely on your opponent to aggress as much. Bluffing also benefits greatly from range advantage because fold equity just goes up. This is really simple. The more fold equity you get, the better. It just becomes more profitable to bluff, so you make more bluffs because they're better. As bluffing gets better and better, you may even have to do it immediately. If fold equity is ridiculously high compared to the mathematical break-even value, then you may just need to seize it instantly. Just bet right away. And thirdly, denial. So since villain's range is relatively weak, a lot of his combos will be air. with live redraw, and we'll benefit more now from the bonus of denial because we'll run into the weak live hands that fold. That's useful for us to get to fold more frequently while avoiding running into the stuff that's going to crush us, right? That's the penalty. That's the price of denial betting. The reason that denial is not a sufficient reason to bet in and of itself is that you incur too much of a price when you run into hands that beat you. The less often that happens, the closer you can get to just like betting to deny equity solely. It doesn't really work that way because any hand you bet for denial on the flop is primarily going to probably still be value bet or bluff, but denial is a more major factor on the flop than it is on the turn for sure. On to nut advantage and flop sizing. How do these things relate? Well, you'll recall from lecture 2 that the higher equity or value betting candidate, the bigger the sizing you can consider using, so the higher the investment ceiling. When we have a large nut advantage, we have more hands in a very high equity region, therefore our range will want to build a large pot more frequently. Range and hand are really linked, right? Accelerating pot growth immediately on the flop is one of the ways that we can do that. Basically, there's a certain amount of money that your really good hands will want to have invested by the river, and if you start investing that sooner into the hand, it's an easier job to get more in by the river. So one of the ways that you can remedy the fact that solvers like to bet 4x pot on the river for value, and you might not want to do that, is by just betting way bigger earlier. And on these boards where you're going to have a lot of overpairs by the river that want to absolutely bomb it, you may well want to use a big bet sooner so that you don't have to use these gigantic river bets. I mean, you can also use a small flop strategy, a small c-bet strategy on flops on which you have a big nut advantage, but then you really have to size up later to actually get enough money for your hand's strength, especially if you have a really polar range against a condensed one and you can't rely on your opponent to raise you. Then you have to go huge. So big or small theorem is the idea that when we have a large nut advantage, we're usually going to adopt a b7a5. That's our bigger bet, and that's going to become our only flop size. I don't like it when students say, I play 3 sizes on the flop here, and I'm like, but you're not a solver, you're a human. Like, the best players in the world don't even choose to do that. They simplify. Most of them do anyway. And when we don't have a large nut advantage, we'll adopt B33. Look at the wording here. When we have a large nut advantage, we're not just saying when we have a nut advantage, we always, practically, as a pre-flop raiser, have a nut advantage and a c-bet opportunity on the flop. Because we opened more aces, kings, queens, big cards pre. Not always. Sometimes big blind has a nut advantage because the flop comes 6-5-4 or 6-6-7 or something like that, and they have a lot more 6x than we do when we open under the gun. But, by and large, we usually have a nut advantage. What's important is not whether we have a nut advantage, it's how much of one we have. Do we have a significant one? A large one? So we're not asking who has the nut advantage, because that's a kind of redundant, annoying, useless question a lot of the time, because a small nut advantage is basically not a nut advantage. It's closer to equality than it is to a large nut advantage, and it's large nut advantages that allow us to size up frequently, because you need to have a significant cluster of really good unique hands in your range in order to want to just start building massive pots right off the bat on the flop. Otherwise, you don't want to do that. Another idea here that we'll talk about a lot in grade 2 is relative polarization. If you have a large nut advantage, it usually means that your opponent's range is quite squashed, capped, condensed, mediocre, and your range is much more polar by having this really good region, and then obviously you'll be bluffing to balance that out and ensure that your strategy's not stupid and always value heavy and nitty, etc. But the point would be, you only want to start this major pot building really early on in a hand when you have a lot of hands that are going to crave eventually a very big pot. Otherwise, there's no point. And if you don't have a big nut advantage, your opponent will raise you a lot usually as well, and then you can make money by betting small and getting raised anyway. So this is the idea. And we are asking, do we have a large nut advantage? Because that's what's sufficient for sizing up the flop, not just being slightly ahead with respect to the nuts. So how do we weigh this up then? How do we really start to understand when a nut advantage is big enough to be important and when it's not? Well, have a look at the following thought experiment. What's the difference, in your opinion, between these two scenarios? Pause the video, write something down, try to answer this like an exam question. This is scenario 1, a horse race. You can see that, say this is the end of the race, this is quite close, right? This horse on the right has reached the finish line before the other horses, but there's not much in it. It would be like microseconds for the other horses to catch up here. But this horse has won the race, it's won the gold medal. Everyone that bet on that light coloured horse at the right has won. And then this scenario, you have a wad of $100 bills against the same wad of $100 bills, right? Don't be like, oh, it could be a different amount of $100 bills. It's not. It's the same amount, plus a penny. What is the difference between the horse race and this comparison of these sums of money? Write it down. So the answer is that in the first case, it doesn't matter how much you win by, but it really matters whether you win. So in the first case, the horse race, being ahead of an opponent by any margin at all is hugely impactful. In the second case, the right-hand sum of money being bigger than the left is totally irrelevant. If you made me choose one of these sums of money, I would choose the one on the left because I don't want to deal with that stupid penny. I don't have to carry it around with me. I'll probably throw it in the bin. I think that's illegal. Pretty sure I've been cleaning my house and put pennies in the bin because they're basically like trash. I don't care about this penny. I want the wad of $100 bills, but in the horse race, I care about a penny equivalent of distance. I care about a millimeter, if and only if that's enough to separate me from the horse behind. In the left-hand picture, the tiniest margin really matters, on the right it doesn't. Range advantage and nut advantage are like the right-hand picture, or the lower picture, let's say. Range advantage and nut advantage are like the wads of money. It doesn't matter if one range has slightly more EV than the other range, slightly more equity. It's just basically going to be a neutral world, right? Like, this is a neutral choice between these two things. Don't fall into the trap of asking yourself who has the range advantage, which horse is slightly ahead. That's not what matters. Hope that's clear, that thought experiment. Before we wrap up, let's look at a few examples of when we should be using different flop strategies. So example 1 is when we're going to use a small sizing with a small frequency. Remember, range advantage affects our frequency of betting, as we saw, because the 3 reasons to bet all become more prevalent. And nut advantage controls our sizing because it affects how many hands want to build a big pot to satisfy a high investment ceiling for their equity. Small is a spot where we don't want to bet often and we want to bet small when we bet. Basically, we have a polarized range for a small sizing. That's okay. You're allowed to do that. You don't have to go big every time you're polarized because they're separate things. Sizing and frequency are defined by separate factors. So here, small blind is not doing that well. He's won the horse race, 52% equity. Small blind has won the horse race here, but that doesn't matter because the 2% is not a big range advantage. So small blind should just be betting at a low frequency here, especially because it's not actually just equity or range advantage that affects bet frequency. Position is going to matter too, as is the polarization of the opponent. And small blind is out of position against quite a polarized range because monotone flops just polarize everyone, therefore doesn't have a range advantage that's worth speaking of, doesn't have a nut advantage that's worth speaking of. You could be like, oh, he's got more ace, queen of spades, who cares, right? It's not a big enough part of the puzzle. So here, the solver chooses to usually just use a small bet. We'll simplify to just always using a small bet and checks 85% of the time. You could simplify the strategy to range checking, but you can see that the strategy is highly derived from the inputs range advantage for frequency, nut advantage for sizing, and these are two separate inputs. You might hear people say something like, but shouldn't we bet bigger if we're only betting rarely? This is the frequency control sizing fallacy. These two things are outputs, they're both independent, and we'll talk more about this in grade 2. This mistakes correlation for cause. We are very often, admittedly, in a situation where we do bet big and bet infrequently. Shoving the river for 2x pot is something you shouldn't do very much in most spots unless you're just massively polar already. But when you do, you have a very big sizing. But that's just correlation. Basically, you want to bet really big when you have loads of hands that crave a high investment ceiling, and you want to bet infrequently when your range isn't doing that well. And usually both of those things are true overall when you're like triple barreling a river, and they're not true on this flop because although you want to bet a polarized strategy here and bet infrequently, you don't want to bet big because your opponent's range is just equally polar to yours. You don't have enough advantage, or if you do, it's too small to speak of. Example 2, small range advantage but big nut advantage. This is also a possibility. So in 7-6 deuce, the button player has effectively no range advantage anymore. I mean, slightly, again, if it's a photo finish of a 100-meter sprint or a horse race, the button is going to win. But of course, we know that poker is not like that at all. It's more of a comparison of VV, or equity. So this is going to be a low bet frequency with a large sizing because the nut advantage is there. Okay, 7-6, 7-6 is the literal nuts. Big blind maybe has them more often than we do because he has a smaller range overall. But we have 9s plus here as unique hands. 9s plus are something like 6x6, 36 combos of overpair. That's a lot. Overpair is going to be about 81% equity here. That's enough on a wet board where flush draws are possible to qualify as a nutted hand in the sense that it wants to crave a big investment ceiling and lots of pot growth. Therefore, let's start with the big c-bet. If you start with a small c-bet here, it's actually quite counterintuitive to play that strategy in my opinion, and the problem with it is that you'll have to go massive later on certain runouts to make up for this, and not everyone's comfortable 3x potting the river, as I said before. So although button has a large nut advantage here, allowing him or her to adopt the B75 as the weapon of choice, big blind is equalized range versus range wise, equity wise, whole range wise, because big blind connects with the 7 and the 6 and pairs them more often than button does, and button's high cards, which button has the monopoly on, unfortunately for button, are suffering on this texture. So button has more bad hands. He has a higher concentration of ace jack off, and ace jack off is a bad hand here by and large. Meanwhile, some of button's unique hands, like 2 big cards, have dropped. When this flop comes down, ace queen goes from being a really good starting hand to a bad hand. This is the sort of flop that is awful for broadways. Button is the king of broadways. If he was a vendor at a market stall, he'd be selling overpairs, broadways, and big cards, and big blind would be selling 7-6 suited. That's the way to think about it. Not that extreme, but that's the direction of it. Example 3, big range advantage, small nut advantage. This is super common. Ace, queen, queen. Hijack's equity here in a single raise pot against big blind is 66%. It's absolutely colossal. It's mammoth. But hijack doesn't really have much of a nut advantage to speak of, because although ace, queen, queens, and aces are more prevalent, that would be the literal nuts fallacy. When it comes to just having a queen, which is a hand with 90-something% equity in general, it's basically quite split. Both players have a ton of queens. Hands like ace, king, ace, jack, kings can be easily defeated here by just having a queen in the former case, or even an ace in the latter case with kings. So big blind has caught up when it comes to the nuts here. At the very top, big blind's range is caught up. Maybe not the very, very top, but in the nutted region, generally speaking, big blind is caught up. So although we see a ton of betting here by hijack, wanting to press all of the 3 reasons to bet further, wanting to capitalize on the immediate fold equity of bluffs, the good trade-off of protection running into air really frequently, and also having loads of natural value bets, we don't want to do that with a big sizing because we don't crave a high investment ceiling yet against a polarized range that has a lot of nutted hands in it. Here, hijack enjoys a huge range advantage, pretty much always bets, but doesn't come from nut advantage. Remember, nut advantage is an ingredient of range advantage, but it's not the ingredient that's stoking the range advantage here. So where do you think hijack's range advantage mainly comes from then? Pause the video, have a think about it, write something down. So firstly, it comes from having less low cards and trash hands as a density of the range. Hijack's range just doesn't really have a lot of 5-7 suited in it or anything like that, and the suited connectors like 10-9 it does have are going to be heavily diluted by all of the bigger cards and offsuit big cards that are quite abundant, like king queen off, ace 10 off. These are going to be a lot of the range, ace jack off. Again, 2 things going on here. One, big blind has unique low cards like 5-7 and also has cards that are more concentrated and awful, like 6-5 suited. Maybe hijack has it 1 combo of the time and it's diluted by all the big cards. Big blind has it 4 combos of the time, maybe, depending on whether he 3-bit bluffs that ever, and it's less diluted, basically. More decent hands. Ace, king, ace, jack, kings. They're not good hands, but they're above average hands. Something like ace, king has about 80% equity here, and that's above the range average of 66. Kings has around the range average of about 66%, probably. Having more of these hands that are just not bad helps, right? Above average hands like ace, x, having them more often than your opponent does, slightly pulls up the equity of your range. Not in a way where you derive a nut advantage and want to go big, but in a way that makes you want to bet frequently. And finally, big range advantage, big nut advantage. That's right, guys, there are indeed spots in poker where you can bet big and bet super often. Jack deuce deuce is one of them. This is basically a brick board apart from the jack. It's incredibly hard to hit this flop, therefore Under the Gun loves that. Under the Gun loves that because his range started off so much more big card heavy and powerful pair heavy than big blind's range did. Big blind's range was relying on a flop like 7-5-3 to come down sometimes in order to call a lot of these bad hands pre. When a board like 7-5-3 or 6-5-4 or 6-6-5 doesn't come down, a jack comes, which is good for Under the Gun because Under the Gun is the Broadway merchant. He's the guy with all the broadways in his inventory, and then the 2 deuces are just totally bricky. The jack will help the range advantage of Under the Gun because it's so jack x heavy, and the deuces will help the nut advantage because they will preserve it because they're not a meaningfully high enough paired card to actually give enough trips to big blind to allow big blind to negate kings, queens, aces, which are obviously 18 very powerful combos that are going to be probably 90% equity here. Like, the thing is that the overpairs now are not going to just be in the 80s on this board, they're going to be in the 90s. That wouldn't be the case on a board like Jack 9-9, or if we reverse this flop, which we'll see in a minute, and make it deuce Jack Jack. So high bet frequency, big sizing, we would simplify this probably to just using R75, just betting big all the time. You could get rid of this 33%, B33, 24% of the time bet. Again, this is the sizing of the bets here, color coded, and then the frequencies down below. And finally, this is a spot where both of these are good. Both range advantage and nut advantage are huge. They're in under the gun's favor, and the best jacks and the overpairs are very powerful. They're mostly unique hands. So while big blind does have more trips here, these hands are scarce enough that they barely matter because it's a deuce that's paired. If this was the flop instead, this would be a small bet texture for under the gun in a single raised pot, because a jack would become the be all and end all, and it would be very prevalent in both ranges, while under the gun would still have the literal nut advantage on Jack, Jack, Deuce. It would be not enough. It would be like winning the horse race instead of having way more value. So this would then call for a small sizing strategy, right? Because it would reduce that nut advantage down to something meaningless, but would still keep a range advantage. In fact, the range advantage would be greater, and we'd probably just bet everything for a small bet. That's what we'd do. Okay, homework task 6. For the following flops, cutoff versus big blind, state whether you think they have a low, medium, or high frequency, and then whether we'll be using a B33 or a B75 on these flops. Pause the video, write it down. I will go over the answers imminently. Let's assume that you've done that. So king, queen, queen, great range advantage, right? Very, very good board for cutoff. He's the big card person, so going to have a lot of king x, queen x. But the presence of the two queens and the king is going to make big blind's range more polarized, more nut heavy. He's going to have a queen very easily just by having a random queen and something else. Again, we don't care who has more queens. That's not the question. The question is, does one player have significantly more queens or a monopoly on queen x? And the answer is no. Therefore, it's a small bet at high frequency. Question 2, we're going to use a big bet here because 10-5-4 is very preserving of overpair power. Overpairs are going to be 82% equity or something like that. Thus, they can crave that high investment ceiling. They can go large. 10-5-4 is not going to be a massively high bet frequency. It won't be really low either, though. It won't be like 17%. Be something like 40% C bets with big sizing when we bet. That's fine. You could play a small bet there, but again, it does make the game tree trickier later, in my opinion. Don't just copy a solver. If it says betting small is okay, that might only be because it's like bombing rivers and you're not, so you have to be careful there. Ace 7-4, also a very neutralizing board when it comes to nut advantage. I wouldn't bet this at a super high frequency either. The 7 and the 4, they're just like reasonable cards for the big blind's range. There's a lot of two pair going on here in big blind's range, a lot of top pair as well. Definitely a small bet because the overpairs have been negated by the presence of the ace. Yes, okay, we have more ace x, but we don't have a monopoly on ace x. We have a monopoly on ace king, but ace king isn't even the nuts here. So definitely just looking for something like a small bet at a medium frequency. Number 4, I would be using a small bet again because the 9 is a relevantly paired card that is going to increase your opponent's nut prevalence and decrease your nut advantage. Of course, you still have a nut advantage, but it's not by that much. So small bets here on queen 9-9. And frequency-wise, it'd be mediocre. I think this board is okay. It's much better for your range than his, but he's kind of polarized here, so I don't think you want to be betting this all the time like you do on king, queen, queen. Jack 7 deuce monotone is very bad for your nut advantage. It neutralizes it almost entirely. Small bets being the way of the monotone flop for that reason. And I don't think it's a fantastic board for range either. I mean, your range will be ahead here in equity, but it'll be like 52-53% in the solver if you look it up. Not worth betting more than about 35-40% of your range here using a small bet. And 6-5-4 I would just never bet. Unless my opponent is going to start donking here and making their checking range more capped and weaker, I'm not betting this flop. Because this flop is abhorrent for me, and because it's so good for big blind has a range advantage and a nut advantage here. They're meant to invest a ton on the turn anyway. And I can just raise there, or I can call there and raise wherever I can make money later, if I've got a really strong hand. So even if I have a set here or like an overpair, I don't have to bet this flop. This is the thing. And yeah, the stronger your opponent's range is, the more you can slow play. Don't fall into the trap of betting just your good stuff on 6-5-4 and building a pitifully weak checking range. That's the main thing to avoid. Alright guys, hope you've enjoyed Lecture 6, a really core building block in the curriculum of the Carrot Poker School. Definitely go over this video again and again and again and take notes and make sure that you're not over or under applying any of these concepts, and I'll see you back here for Lecture 7. See you next time.